Avoiding deception. In a world of lies and deception, we should consistently evaluate what we read, hear, and see in light of the message in the Holy Scriptures. Here's Dr. Gene Getz to explain.
When you look at this psalm, you're going to see a picture of humanity really at its worst, especially from David's perspective. And I think there's a lesson there as well. I think David is speaking from a reality, but he's also speaking from a perspective of feeling alone, like he's the only one left. And so here's what he prayed. Help, Lord, for no faithful one remains. In other words, he's saying, I'm absolutely alone. That reminds me of Elijah, by the way, after the great victory over the prophets of Baal. And he's hiding. He's running. He knows that if he doesn't, Jezebel is going to take his life. He ends up in a cave. And God said, what are you doing here? And he said, I'm the only one left. Well, that's how he felt. And the Lord reminded him, no, you're not the only one left. There are 7,000 that haven't bowed the knee to Baal. And I think there's some of that here as far as David is concerned. He feels like he is alone. So he says, help, Lord, for no faithful one remains. The loyal have disappeared from the human race. And that obviously is a generalization. And I think there's an element of truth prophetically. But here is a picture really of humanity and what happens to humanity. And we'll read about that in a moment. But here's what David sees. They lie to one another. They speak with flattering lips and deceptive hearts. We've all seen that. And if it's bad now, in essence, what the Scriptures say, just wait a while. Because we know it's going to get worse. And we shouldn't be surprised that that is actually happening. And so David is pouring out his heart. He says in verse 4, they say, through our tongues, we have power. Our lips are our own. Who can be our master? And that's the ultimate in arrogance. In other words, there's no authority beyond myself. This, of course, is denying God as well. Now, we have a situation here, I think, that regardless of whether or not David had a correct perspective, he was also speaking of reality. Because as we look around us today, as we look at the media, as we look at the messages that are coming through in literature, on television, as we look at even in the religious world, we're seeing a lot of deception. And a lot of purposeful deception of manipulating people and taking advantage of people. And if you study even the history of most religious movements that are out of harmony with the will of God, you will see there's a lot of deception. In fact, Peter prophesied about that. In 2 Peter chapter 2, he says, but there were also false prophets among the people, speaking of the past, just as there will be false teachers among you today. He's speaking to believers in the first century. Notice what he says. They will secretly bring in destructive heresies. They will secretly bring in destructive heresies. In other words, it's a scheme. It's deception. Even denying the master who brought them, and will bring swift destruction on themselves. And there, in essence, Peter picks up the very same word that David used in terms of saying they're their own masters. They're responsible to no one except themselves. Peter goes on saying, many will follow their unrestrained ways, and the way of truth will be blasphemed because of them. They will exploit you in their greed with deceptive stories or words. In fact, I really like one translation that says, in their greed, these teachers will exploit you with stories they have made up. And to be honest with you, I have sat and listened to some religious people as they have communicated, and in my spirit, forgive me if I'm judging, I conclude it's a story they're making up. Or that it's partial truth. It's not the whole truth. To manipulate people. And so here's the question for reflection and response. In what ways are some Christians being deceived by messages that contradict the Scriptures? Well, if I open this up for discussion and just sharing, all of us could share stories. You could share events, even things that you've seen today in the secular media. You'll see materialism glorified as being the answer to our problems. You'll see sensualism exemplified as being the answer to happiness in this world. Actual perversion even. You're going to see messages of irresponsible freedom, of taking freedoms that anyone realizes is going to lead to self-destruction. But you'll never hear the end result of that. You'll hear the Playboy philosophy being promoted as the key to happiness. You'll read in women's magazines a whole value system that distorts the marriage vows. That's deception. Presented as true. This is reality. You're not living in an up-to-date world if you believe those old-fashioned values that you see in the Bible. And there are a lot of people that are being led astray. They buy into that. In the religious world, you see emotionalism. Now, Christianity can be very emotional and should be in our hearts, in praise and adoration. But when you see emotionalism that manipulates people, you got a real problem. Postmodern ideas that creep into the gospel message. And one of those is that, in essence, there is no hell. Only heaven. Universalism. Distorting the truth of Scripture. A false theology. The power of positive thinking. And I believe we ought to be positive in our thinking of all people. But the fact is, the power of positive thinking can really ignore reality and can lead to incredible confusion. So we see all kinds of distortions even within the religious world today. In fact, if you'll make a study of all of the cults that are diversions from Christianity, you will find that many of the founders of those cults had a hidden agenda that they were covering up, and the hidden agenda was immorality. Because a lot of the religious leaders that started these cults were marching to their own drum in terms of immorality, but covering it up with a false theology in order to camouflage their own desires and their own behaviors. And that's a reality that you can demonstrate once you study that whole situation. So, here's the principle. In a world of lies and deception, we should consistently evaluate what we read, hear, and see in the light of the message in the Holy Scriptures. The Holy Scriptures are the only resource that we can ultimately trust to tell us the truth.